Like my number one pet peeve is when a resident goes in the room and says, "I'm going to check your cervix." My name's Madison. I'm located around Hartford, Connecticut. So we have it kind of set up in a way I really like because I've worked at different hospitals and I've seen it done kind of different ways. So we sit in the same room with all the residents. We all look at the same charts and the same strips on the same computers. There's not really totally assigned seating. And we're all kind of in this, I guess, fishbowl together for like 12 hours at a time. And I really appreciate that it's kind of like a more like casual environment, just in that like you can kind of lean over and be like, hey, like, can we look at this strip together really fast? And they're like, yeah, of course. Even today I did that with one of the attendings where she happened to be sitting next to me and it's like, hey, can we just look at this together? And I've never had them say no. It's super accessible. Everyone's names are posted. I know that's really stressful in like a big hospital system. Is that like, wait, who is that? So we have the attendings names, the residents' names, and we also have a lot of med students. And we get residents from the ED who come to like learn how to deliver a baby. And everyone's name for the shift is like on the whiteboard. So even if you're like, I have no idea who that is, you can easily figure it out by kind of looking and being like, okay, they're wearing ED scrubs. That's who that must be. And yeah, I feel super supported at my job and talking to the residents. We follow each other on Instagram, like silly stuff like that, where it's, you're really a collaborative pair. They kind of will come and talk to you while they're charting and be like, man, like, how do you think that went in there? Was I like weird? Was I awkward? And so we can kind of bounce things off of each other and everyone's learning and it's great. Yeah, so I came from a different hospital system, not in Connecticut, and I was a new grad at that hospital. So it was kind of, I guess, all I knew at first. And it was a good experience, like, no shade. But at the same time, the nurses sat completely separate from the residents. So being like a new grad, now look, like if I worked there now, it would be like more okay. But I remember being like fresh and being like, oh my gosh, I have to walk in that room full of doctors and they're all going to turn around and look at me as soon as the door opens because I have to swipe in. And they're all going to be like, of course, how can I help you? But it was this level of like, I have to go into their space and kind of, I remember feeling like I was like making my case. Like, I think we should do this because, and you really had to like defend yourself because you're the only nurse surrounded by like 17 doctors who were very nice, but there just wasn't that level of connection. You also didn't really get to know them beyond when you were like asking them for something. So there was not like a level of peer-to-peer connection. It was strictly when you were going and asking for orders. So where I am now, I love because like I know that my R2 has a dog walker and that she has 2 dogs and oh my gosh, can I send you the Spotify playlist because the patient wants it to play in the OR? What's your phone number? Stuff like that, where it's more of like, yes, you can go and ask for an order, but you also kind of have the ability to connect with them on a personal level, which I think nurses and doctors don't always get, which I think is sad because we are coworkers when it really comes down to it. Yes, they're giving us orders and we're doing those orders, but at the end of the day, we're a team, and nurses are not there just to like go and make their case for an order and then do that order or be rejected in that order. It's really like a collaborative experience. I think the biggest difference is sitting in the same room. If you're with someone for like 12 hours, like you have to talk to each other. It's like forced. Like you can't like sit in a room for 12 hours and learn absolutely nothing about each other. You spend Christmas with these people, you spend Thanksgiving with these people, you spend holidays, you spend like, it's 3 a.m. and you can't just sit there and look at each other. So I think in such a high stress job, which is like obstetrics, you really kind of are almost like forced to form these relationships with who you're sitting with. So I think nursing staff is pretty good at having positive relationships, but having the doctors in that room, for me at least, made a huge difference because having those personal relationships with them made it so much easier to be like, hey, I'm really concerned right now. I think on labor and delivery, we're very lucky. I'll give a shout out to all my postpartum nurses because I've heard from in our own hospital, I know they've said they're not as comfortable calling the residents. They're harder to reach because they're relying on pagers, phone calls, and they're calling people that they don't talk to as much. And so, we've kind of, in my own hospital system, addressed those barriers of like, how can we make these residents accessible for people that aren't in the same room? So I think I'm lucky because I'm like on labor and delivery, which is where all the residents hang out and everything like that. And we have 24/7 staff in the hospital and like really on the floor. But I know there are floors where, not obstetrics, not labor and delivery, not postpartum, totally outside the realm of women's health, where the residents go home at 4 p.m. or there's no residents and the attending is covering like 3 floors in the hospital. So I think we're lucky to have this opportunity to kind of really have that FaceTime with our providers. I really try my hardest not to let a doctor go into a room without me. Not because I don't trust them, not because I don't want them in there alone with the patient, but because as a nurse, there's really very few things that a doctor and your patient will be talking about that are not going to be relevant to you and how you're taking care of that patient. And our doctors are pretty good and they know like, hey, is it okay if I go into this room right now? Do you want to come with? Especially on labor and delivery where we usually only have one patient. There really wouldn't be a time where I would be like unable to go into the room with the doctor if they were going into my patients. Just talking about humanizing providers, knowing that, they're not going to be like upset with me if I'm like, hey, I just quite don't understand this. My big thing is saying, can you walk me through this? Because I really truly believe that I have yet to meet a provider who did like 8 years of med school and like 4 years of residency because they like didn't want to take care of people, right? Like, I don't know, maybe there's someone out there, but I have yet to meet them. So I think, going into it and being like, can you just explain your reasoning to me? And I've had times where I've said that and then they explain the reasoning to me and I'm like, that's a really good idea. You kind of shifted my lens. And I've also had times where I'm like, okay, I hear you, but this is what I'm thinking. And I think just having that ability to have that open flow of conversation is super helpful because you're not just talking in the patient's room. I think talking in the patient's room is important to each other, but I also think there needs to be conversations outside of the patient's room, which again, that kind of open floor plan kind of allows and facilitates, because otherwise you're only having these important conversations like in front of the person you're trying to take care of. So then there's this dynamic of, well, I don't want to like make the patient think the doctor's not good. I don't want to, offend the doctor by asking this question. But I think kind of opening it up like a question, because I don't think anyone's in the hospital making a decision that they think is wrong. So if you just go and think, well, or go and say, well, I think this, they're going to say, well, I don't agree with you. And that kind of closes that door. But if you're like, can you just explain to me? And then say you don't agree, you can always be like, well, this is what I'm thinking. I have some concerns with the plan. Because at the end of the day, it's about the plan and it's about the patient. And I think that's something really central that like all healthcare workers can always come back on. So I think as the nurse, I'm always trying to think like 3 steps ahead. Like what could happen, especially depending on the patient. But, a lot of our patients are anxious because they've read really scary things on the internet. They've seen TikToks. A lot of them, we're going on years and years and years of having not great maternal health rates. So these people know, I have had multiple patients. I always ask what are you afraid of? What makes you anxious? And they're like, I'm afraid of dying. So I think having that kind of awareness of where they're coming from, I think it's easy to get sucked into well, I do this 40 hours a week, but most of these people only do this once, twice, maybe 3 times in their whole life. So I think just kind of coming from that spot of this is like brand new. Like my number one pet peeve is when a resident goes in the room and says, I'm going to check your cervix. And like, so that would be like another reason I would like to be in the room, because I would kind of follow up with, is it okay? Are you okay with that? Do you have any questions on like why we would want to do that? Or if I know that, you know, they're going to check their cervix, or their plan is to check the cervix, I'll say, hey, I think they're going to check your cervix soon. Do you have any questions about that? How can we make you more comfortable for that? Are you okay with that? And honestly, I've had patients tell me I'm really would prefer not to have my cervix checked. And I'm able to go tell the doctor that before they even go in, so that doesn't put the patient or the doctor in like an awkward situation. And we can just like avoid the interaction altogether. I think patients a lot of times are more comfortable with us than they are providers, not for any reason other than they just see us more. So a lot of times I always let the doctors leave the room, and the doctors will always say, do you have any questions? And then I let them leave. And I would say like 50% of the time, then I ask, do you have any questions? And they have a question. And even if I don't know the answer to that question, I'm going to say, well, hold on. I can find out the answer. I can find someone who knows the answer. Just these patients see their nurses the most. So if they have a question, or if they feel like it's a silly question, I feel like they're more comfortable asking us. There's a fine line between being honest with the patient and like stressing them out. So I think kind of read the room. I will tell someone if I'm worried about their baby, if I think their strip doesn't look good. But I also think, you know, being like, hey, to the provider, I'm really struggling turning this patient's Pitocin up. She's having lates with every contraction. What would you recommend I do? I don't necessarily think that has to happen in the room. So, because you're like making a plan. I think the patient should be involved in the plan, and you should go in and say, hey, are you okay if I give a fluid bolus? Let's try to flip. I think that might help with the lates I'm seeing after your contractions. But kind of that brainstorming, that collaborative kind of care, I like to help outside of the room.